From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, thank you all for coming. I'm John Haskell. I'm the director of the Kluge Center here at the Library of Congress, and we, together with the Center for the Book, represented by Guy Lamal, I can never pronounce your name. Help me with this. Guy, anyway, is his name. He and us worked on this project, and we're glad you came to see the program. The Kluge Center is our mission, as established in the Charter in 2000, is to, quote, reinvigorate the interconnection between thought and action, bridging the gap between scholarship and policy making. To that end, we have programs like this one, where we bring, in this case, one of our former chairs, former Kissinger chair, Bruce Jentleson, to talk about a book that he was working on while he was at Kluge. We'll get into that more shortly. Let me tell you a little bit about Bruce. He's a professor of political science and public policy at the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University. Bruce's degrees at the bachelor's and doctoral level are from Cornell University, and he has a master's degree from the London School of Economics. The current book is The Peacemakers, which is what we're going to talk about today, Lessons in Leadership from 20th Century Statesmen. That is coming out right now, essentially, right? Yeah, like today. Right, yeah. You can get one afterward, and Bruce will sign it for you. He has a textbook called American Foreign Policy that's in its 5th edition. Probably some of you have had that assigned to you, and I'm sure you read it carefully. He also wrote The End of Arrogance, America in the Global Competition of Ideas, and With Friends Like These, Reagan, Bush, and Saddam, 1982 to 1990. Bruce is one of those academics who, in his career, has done a lot in the policy side, which informs and most of us think here at the Kluge Center, all of us think here at the Kluge Center makes one scholarship better. He was senior advisor to the State Department from 2009 to 2011 for the Obama administration, and he served on the 2012 campaign National Security Advisory Steering Committee. He was a senior foreign policy advisor to Vice President Gore during the 2000 campaign, and he served in the Clinton administration State Department. He also worked in the United States Senate, both for Senator Al Gore when he was in the Senate, and also for Senator David Dernberger, who was a Republican from Minnesota many years ago. Bruce is co-founder with a gentleman, Jim Goldgeier, who will be Kissinger Chair come this fall, of Bridging the Gap, which is a project promoting greater policy relevance among academics. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But let's dive into the first question, Bruce, and I just want to know why you wrote this book.
Well, first of all, let me say thank you for the invitation to be here today, to the sponsors, and a special thank you to the Kluge Center. I spent the 2015-16 academic year here as the Kissinger Chair. There would be no book if it was not for the opportunity to do research while I was here. Thanks especially to Jay McAuliffe, who was head of Kluge at that point when I applied, and was gracious enough to accept my application, so I really appreciate that. So, you know, a lot of the work I've done, as John said, you know, in the policy world as well as my academic work has been on, you know, deeply intractable foreign policy international problems. I spent a number of years working in the Middle East on various peace talks and a variety of other issues. I worked on so-called responsibility to protect and genocide prevention. And this book deals with, you know, many intractable problems, but I tried to focus in this on ones in which major breakthroughs were made during the 20th century of a variety of types by a variety of leaders. So at one point, I was beginning to think that I was writing this book as a mental health exercise to keep me thinking about the positives. It's not about any perfect pieces. None of these were, you know, absolute peace that was fully enduring. That book would be very, very short and thin. But I did decide to finish it and then enjoy the mental health benefits of talking about it to people. But it was very important, I thought, to talk about when we see these very difficult problems in the world of a variety of types, for both practical strategy and inspiration, to see where leaders really were able to make major breakthroughs and learn from that what we can for the 21st century agenda.
So you have experience in both academics and in policy. How did that influence the writing of this book? I mean, in a sense, how did you bring those two together in this book?
So it's interesting. Those, John and others who've been through PhD programs in political science, there's very little emphasis on what they call the individual level of analysis on leaders. It's about institutions. It's about processes. When you study international relations, it's about, enduring concepts like balance of power and national interest, as much of it should be. Indeed, put a number on it, 70 to 80% of what happens in international affairs, who the leader is matters a little, but not fundamentally. In Washington, having spent a lot of time inside the Beltway, not just Kluge Center, but the other positions I've had, sometimes there can be like too much emphasis on leaders. Who did what, what's the chemistry, who winked at whom, et cetera, et cetera. And so I was looking for sort of a balance point between those. And one of the ways I thought about it, I used an epigram from Isaiah Berlin to start the book, which is always a good idea to quote Isaiah Berlin when you start a book. You can't go wrong. He said, at crucial moments, at turning points, individuals and their decisions and acts can determine the course of history. And that's really what I look at, crucial moments at turning points, not day to day, what I call in the book transformational moments, not just the transactional part. And I actually got a little bit of an inspiration from an article that some colleagues wrote about so-called bad guy leaders. And in that article, they looked at, for example, Germany and Hitler and said there's no question that Germany was going to be unstable after World War I. But the particular form that instability took had an awful lot to do with Hitler as the leader. Similarly with Napoleon after the French Revolution, France was going to be unstable. And so I tried to flip that around and look at it from a positive point of view. And so it was really trying to find a middle ground there about where leaders matter, and then to flesh out a little bit of a framework of how they really matter and what we could learn from that.
So that, when I just saw the title, before the book was even available, I thought, I wonder what the criteria are to be a peacemaker. I mean, is there like an entrance requirement? What are the qualifications?
So one of the fun things of the book, it's written very much as in the publishing industry, they call it trade book. It's not just written for academics and policy wonks, but it's really for broad audiences that have interest in what's going on in the world. And so if I was really savvy, I'd have a social media game out there now with the book, right? For people to choose their own 20th century peacemakers. So we do say, when I thought about what I mean by peacemakers and global peace and security, I break it into 5 different categories. One is the major powers geopolitics, because conflicts among major powers historically have been a principal cause of war, and rapprochement between major powers has been crucial to peace. Secondly, building international institutions. Third, reconciling the politics of identity in terms of conflicts that are core based on issues of identity. Fourth is advancing freedom and human rights, and fifth is fostering global sustainability. And so in each of those areas, I try to have representative cases. And the criteria that I use are, one, that it's about transformational statesmanship, not just transactional. It's efforts to really make a breakthrough in the intractable problems. Secondly, and here I'll confess, as I was coming in, I saw that there's a baseball Americana exhibit in the Jefferson Building in June, which I've got to come back for because I'm a total baseball fan. And anybody that follows the Moneyball, there's this statistic called wins against replacement player, or WARP, which is how many wins does this particular shortstop contribute to his team, calculated against every other shortstop in baseball, and there's a fancy formula. And so I call mine Statesmanship Moneyball. And I don't really have a statistical formula, I just base it on the basis of the argument and the evidence, and try to say that this leader made choices that another leader in that situation wouldn't have made. For example, there's a chapter on Gorbachev, and I strongly argue against those that say any Soviet leader would have had to make the choices he did. And so that's the second criteria. Is it really something that the particular leader had a set of choices and political skills? And the third one is what I call impact had, not position held. And there I broaden the concept of statesmanship. So it's not only, as we'll see as we go along, about presidents and prime ministers, secretaries of state, foreign ministers. There are some chapters in there that are about leaders of NGOs. There are some chapters in there that are about social movements in which they did things that governments were either unable or unwilling to do. And again, as we think about the 21st century, we're going to see even more of that. So those were kind of the criteria I used. And when we have discussion, I'd love to hear, why don't you have so-and-so and so-and-so? And that's what kind of makes, but I was very clear that these are representative cases, not necessarily comprehensive, and closing the book. So
it's funny that sometimes statesmen are considered to be commissioner of baseball, like George Mitchell might not have peace in Ireland if he hadn't gone that route. Right. I don't know. But so one of the ones that you count as a peacemaker who would certainly be controversial in some quarters would be Henry Kissinger. Mm-hmm. So as the former Kissinger chair, perhaps you could speak to that.
There were no strings tied to the Kissinger chair that would be included in the book. I had a distinguished fellowship at the Woodrow Wilson Center too. In fact, my chapter in Wilson is highly, highly critical of Wilson in ways that I didn't even realize before I started doing the research. So another criteria is it's not about the overall record, it's about particular areas of statesmanship. Kissinger is in the book along with Zhou Enlai for the US-China opening. Not for Vietnam or other things, and I acknowledge that these are areas that, that I personally disagreed with. But I feel like we need to learn things from leaders, rather than everybody's in this basket called a great leader and this basket called a flawed leader. We need to try to learn from a variety. And so that really looks at the breakthrough that was made in US-China relations. Sometimes when we look back at history, we say, well, of course they made a breakthrough back then. they had a mutual sort of enemy or adversary in the Soviet Union. But if you go back, and if you had gone to Las Vegas or Ladbrokes if you're in London, in early 1971 said, I'd like to place a bet that the United States and Red China, as we used to call it in those days, are going to have some sort of rapprochement-style relationship. We all could have been wealthier than we are. And so I look into that. I did have the opportunity to interview Kissinger for that research. And one really, when you do this kind of research, a lot of the documents are declassified, so I had the documentary record. I had work that was been done by other scholars, a whole variety of things. But you get the color when you do the interviews, and I'll give you one example of that. There'd been, when Kissinger first meets Zhou Enlai in July 1971, and what was called as the secret Operation Marco Polo. They had this great name for it. Although you would have thought if somebody heard the name, they would have thought it might have something to do with China, right? And the first thing it says, he walks in and he puts out his hand to shake Zhou Enlai's hand. So I asked Kissinger about that because he couldn't quite tell from the documentary record. And he tells this story. He says, back in 1955 at the Geneva Convention, after the French were defeated in Vietnam and Vietnam was being broken up and the rest of Southeast Asia, John Foster Dulles, very hawkish American Secretary of State, Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov, he of the cocktail, and Zhou Enlai, the Chinese Foreign Minister, were there. And Dulles showed up and he shook Molotov's hand, but he wouldn't shake Zhou Enlai's hand. Again, this was Red China. I mean, you read some of the things at the time, and we thought they were much worse than even the Soviet Union. And so Kissinger, and he says it wasn't me, it was some China experts he had on his staff, said that this is a real gesture of building trust. And it really meant a lot. As they got to know each other, Zhou Enlai at a later meeting told Kissinger how much that meant to him. And that had really stayed with him for, 16, 17 years. And so it's the kind of thing that is in the book that you pick up the color from the interviews that gives you a sense of this really being Kissinger at his best, great power, statesmanship, which was very different than some other areas.
So you can see why why this could be considered transformational. What happened with China? Why was Kissinger, in your wins above replacement, comparison? Why was he important here?
So I talk about it, why not Nick? And every story I tell is not just about a single individual. Others come in. It's not hero worship, but I focus on the individual that I think was that statesmanship Moneyball. So my little one-liner is Nixon and Mao got the opera, and Kissinger and Zhou Enlai did the statesmanship. The statesmanship was very intricate, and they spent 17 hours in those first set of meetings, basically in one-on-ones with translators. And maybe with one aide. And they had an enormous amount to work through. And the essence of it was one of the United States' main motivations is we wanted more help from China on Vietnam, because the Soviets weren't giving it. And China wanted a lot from us on Taiwan. That was the transactional point. We got less on Vietnam than we wanted, but we got some. They got less on Taiwan in the moment they wanted, they got some. And there's a statement that Zhou Enlai makes in which he basically says, well, I'll interpret this. He says, conventional thinking about statesmanship is you got to work out the transactional, and sort of the aggregate sum of this deal and that deal is going to lead to change in the relationship. And he actually says, you know, you really need to start with the transformational. There needs to be a sense that the relationship is transforming, that trust is being building up, whatever concessions are made that will lead to other progress in the relationship, and that the transformational actually has to precede or at least accompany the transactional, which we can talk about in relation to any number of things, you know, U.S.-Korea or Iran or whatever. And so the way they worked out the statesmanship, and I go into some detail, not as much as if it was a straight academic book, there were any number of points where it could have broken down. Nixon and Mao were absolutely necessary for the politics, but I felt like that there was more of a story to tell about the statesmanship, and so make them, and that's a paired chapter where, if you like, it's a 50-50, giving credit, because both of them were crucial, not just Kissinger.
So how did Aung San Suu Kyi qualify? How did she make the grade?
That's really an interesting story. That chapter is titled A Cautionary Tale. And I'd started writing it, actually I was working on it when I was here, about the role she played in Burma, Myanmar from 1988 to 2015, which again was quite extraordinary, an enormous amount of personal and moral courage, a leadership that pretty much only she could provide with her heritage of being the daughter of one of the founders of the country, and a whole variety of other factors. And then as we were finishing the book last summer, the Rohingya genocide is taking place. And you're getting articles like from Nicholas Kristof about, seeing a Nobel Peace Prize winner, not necessarily doing this, military was, but at minimum being complicit. So my editor, Norton, and I called him and said, I wonder if we should pull the chapter. We actually had a couple chapters that we didn't include because we were looking at length. And I give him credit. He said, let's think about this. The whole theme of the book is to draw lessons from where leaders had skills and where they didn't. And there actually was a pattern emerging. There's a chapter on Lech Walesa, who was a terrible president of Poland, but was an extraordinary leader of the Polish Revolution. There's a chapter on Gandhi and his role in anti-colonialism and Indian independence. He was assassinated, but nobody ever thought he could be a leader in government, right? And so the pattern that was emerging was certain skill sets help bring certain kinds of change, and they don't necessarily carry over to consolidating, institutionalizing. So, we did a little bit of reframing it and made very clear about what we were saying and what we weren't. We're concerned, some people might say, how could she possibly be in the book? And I understand that opinion and respect it. Roger Cohen, New York Times columnist, wrote a column that also came out, and I've known him for a while I was thinking about this, and he said, we in the West have a tendency to either idealize or demonize people, and we need to break out of that. And so that's the essence of that chapter. It's the cautionary tale of both dimensions, and we felt it was important to keep it in the same way I have Woodrow Wilson in for what his failures were, not his successes, even with what was happening.
So you touched on this, the next question I have for you, you touched on this a minute before, so I'm going to try to pin you down. What's your position on people have the age-old question, is it that leaders make history or history makes leaders?
Yeah, and that's...
It's hard to say, which,
right.
but you brought it up, so I wanted to...
I did, and going back to the academic training, I'd get in a couple of papers, related to this where I fleshed this out more, and there's a lot of footnotes in there to some of the literature on this. The basic formulation I use is what I call the 3 C's. The constraints that any leader faces in making change, the conducive conditions that they may have, but then the domain of choice that's with the leader. And so that's that middle ground. It acknowledges that there may be conducive conditions, like in the Kissinger-Zhou Enlai case, the fact that Sino-Soviet relations were deeply strained, and we were looking for leverage as we went into the détente negotiations with the Soviets, was a conducive condition. At the same time, there were enormous constraints. The China lobby was hugely powerful in this country, and China had just come out of the Cultural Revolution, and Mao wasn't convinced he wanted this. But that domain of choice, and when that domain of choice really is decisive, is where I feel the focus on leaders is really helpful. And so everybody in the book, and I kind of take it on about the whole, was this really inevitable? If we get academic with it, the dependent variable, but that's really it is. I think there's a middle ground there that goes on. And again, I think we inside the Beltway maybe get too much into the everything about, the leader and the academic world. So that was the effort. And, bringing some of the work back into the academic world, I'm trying to get people to start thinking about how they can pay more attention to the role that leaders have and not just the broad things that you can model.
Yeah, and presidential historians, maybe the greatest one, it's about persuasion and choice. Right. And you don't explain, obviously persuasion's a part of what you're looking at with these people as well.
I do. The framework I develop is what I call the who, why, how, what. Who are these people as individuals? Not getting super Freudian, but what were their qualities as individuals that led them? Yitzhak Rabin is in the book in a chapter called Soldier as Peacemaker. What were his qualities that led from his transformation of the Minister of Defense, who, as he said, was breaking knuckles during the first Intifada, to somebody that really had a vision for peace with the Palestinians and took it pretty far before he was assassinated. So who are they as individuals? And many of them, you don't really see these leadership qualities from the beginning. At the end, I talk about, kind of runs against the, the resume, the political consultant. Let me look at the things on the resume. It's sort of person and moment. Why did they do what they did? What was the vision that brought them to try to take the risks of these changes and that they used to get people to buy into it? Change is a scary thing. And how did they provide people a sense of that the current context needed to be changed, whether it's Mandela or Rabin or Valenza or others? And then how do they go about it? And that's where there's this mix of ideas and political skills. And some of the limits, Rabin, for example, I'm both I give him enormous amount of credit, but I talk about where his political skills failed him. Same with Gorbachev, that his political skills were really failing him in those last couple of years in consolidating and taking care of his base. But it's a mix, I think, of the two biggest qualities are personal capital that people bring to this that gives people a sense that they are authentic, in Aung San Suu Kyi's case, in Mandela's case, in Valenza's case, and political skills. And then the what is, what did they achieve and what didn't they? And again, what can we learn from both?
So you mentioned, you have to, a leader has to adjust to change. Change is inevitable, but the communications change is radical these days with social media. What does that do to a leader's capacity?
So let me just really quickly pull out something I start the epilogue with, if I can find it quickly, that speaks to that. So this is a quote that I'm just going to read. For our everyday life is becoming so saturated with the tremendous power of mass communications. Our political life is becoming so expensive, so mechanized, and so dominated by professional politicians and public relations men that the idealist who dreams of independent statesmanship is rudely awakened by the necessities of election and accomplishment. That's from John Kennedy in Profiles of Courage in 1956. And the book is actually a little bit modeled on Profiles in Courage, but it's not just American senators, it's international leaders, it's not domestic. And so he's writing that in 1956. So it wasn't just today. There's no question that social media, I know from my time, in the foreign policy world in Washington, the need to make decisions quickly. God only knows if the Cuban Missile Crisis had occurred with social media and their ability to keep control of information to a great extent then. That has complicated it, but I try to do a push, not only in the book, but in some of my other work, against too much presentism. There are things unique about our era, but in some ways, other leaders have faced the same kind of problems. And here's Kennedy writing about them in 1956, without social media, without the internet, in a different age. So it has changed it, but to be honest with you, I say in the book, we've seen the emergence, for better or worse, of very powerful, strong leaders. I'm saying this is a purely analytic point, but there's no question that President Donald Trump has demonstrated the impact an individual can have in the position of the presidency. So the notion that the presidency can't provide leadership, Putin and others, and I'm here giving maybe examples that aren't necessarily on the constructive side, but I think that that it shows that leadership is possible, even in this environment. And there's a lot of bottom-up that happens. The Arab Spring was bottom-up. There's a lot of middle-out that happens from science, technology. There's some work here where I draw on the business literature and the challenges of transformation in the business community or the higher ed community are in some ways similar. But I don't think that I think you have to take into account certain characteristics of today's political and communications environment but it's not totally unique compared to others.
Now, of course, people probably by and large haven't had an opportunity to read the book yet here, and lest anybody get the impression that you're doing a great man theory of history, there are chapters in there about social movements, NGOs, that kind of thing. Do you want to say a word or two about those?
Sure. So three of the chapters that relate to that, I'll mention briefly. One is on Northern Ireland and two Northern Irish women, Betty Williams and Mayreed Corrigan, who were everyday folks. And the story starts from 1969 on, what's called the Troubles, the level of violence and killing was rapidly going up. And in 1972, Mayreed Corrigan's sister was walking down a street in Belfast with four of her children, and an IRA getaway car, driver lost control, smashed into them, injured her seriously, and killed a couple of the children. And it was being chased by a British police car. And so Mayreed Corrigan, who was a secretary in a Guinness brewery, goes to the hospital, and this actually relates to your previous question, and comes out, and the BBC reporters are all out there, and she makes a statement along the lines of, I have the exact quote in the book, of, only less than 5% of the people in Northern Ireland really want these things to happen. The rest of us are tired of it. And as we would say today, it went viral. It went all over BBC. It went all over the world. It was a person and moment. Betty Williams, was another person in Northern Ireland. They come together. They organize the Northern Ireland Women for Peace. And they bring in some political organizers. And the level of violence never goes up to that level. It takes another 20 plus years, and our friend George Mitchell and the negotiator skills to bring the Good Friday Agreement around. And in fact, Betty Williams and Mayreed Corrigan win the Nobel Peace Prize, I think in 76 or 77. And they reach the limit of their political skills. They kind of get pushed aside. There are a couple of small scandals that get pushed aside, and others take it over. But they were transformational for that moment. There were all these marches all over Northern Ireland. It really changed the dynamics. I was in graduate school in London at that time, and there were bombings in Harrods and other sorts of things. So that's one of the stories that shows how, civil society, if you will, can transform the moment. Again, can't make the peace agreement. And whatever else is happening in Northern Ireland today, it's hardly total peace, but it has not gone back to the violence that it was. Second story is about the rise of the contemporary global human rights movement. And I started with, and it's, again, the contemporary goes back many centuries. In 1961, a British lawyer by the name of Peter Benenson, who was sort of an odd duck, had run for the House of Commons 3 times and lost, but had been involved, actually through his mother and others, in protecting children in the 30s and 40s, not only from Hitler, but from Franco and Salazar in Spain and Portugal. And so he begins to think about what he calls prisoners of conscience, and he writes an op-ed in the Observer of London. And again, it goes viral. I mean, I've written a lot of op-eds in my life, and you always hope they go viral, maybe a few Twitterings, but not a lot. And it's picked up by newspapers all over the world. And it's this new concept for a grassroots human rights organization. Within 3 years, donations are coming in, and the number of chapters at Amnesty International increases exponentially. By 1967, he's actually kicked out of the organization. Again, political skills took him to a certain point, and others take it over, and it grows as we know Amnesty International today. But it really seeds the human rights movement, Human Rights Watch, all these groups we know today, that in many ways you could argue are more prominent, but they really kicked it off, and they do, in many respects in human rights, what governments are unable or unwilling to do. And so that's one of the other stories that, again, non-obvious, he wasn't somebody that you saw coming. And the third one is about the Gates Foundation and its work in global public health, and what I call the rise of philanthropy statesmanship. The Gates Foundation is the second largest budget in the world today for global public health, next to the World Health Organization. And what they have done in that sector, and it's not, there are criticisms of the Gates Foundation, and I address those, just like with Aung San Suu Kyi and Kissinger. But I do believe on balance that they've made an enormous difference there, and that they exemplify this emergence of philanthropy statesmanship, the role of philanthropies, Bill Gates and Warren Buffett now have this giving pledge where they're getting very wealthy people around the world to commit to not just foundations that spend at their 5%, but to give away 50% of their wealth in their lifetime. So those are three examples that complement, the Kissingers, the Rabins, the Mandelas, that I think really are statesmanship in their own way. And again, in the 21st century, I think are trend lines that are going up.
So let's talk about the 21st century and sort of draw some lessons, because your Peacemakers, among many other things, contributed to the end of the Cold War, but things aren't great right now.
Right.
Some would argue between the U.S. and Russia. And what kind of lessons do you draw from in the book about that?
Yeah, I've been really pushing back against people calling this new Cold War stuff. It's an easy little one-liner, but if you think about it, it's not global, it's not ideological, and we're not on the brink of nuclear war. As I look around the room, those of us who lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis can remember that all too well. It's classic major power competition. U.S.-China has an element of that. The case I've actually been in the process of trying to write something to make the linkage on is looking at the Summitry from those and how it relates to the U.S. prospective U.S.-North Korea summit. And the pattern that I trace in both the Gorbachev chapter and Reagan, I give more credit to Reagan than probably some other academics do, maybe less than some people that are on the conservative side, but he was a crucial partner. My argument is really Gorbachev was the absolutely indispensable one, and the Kissinger is, there were three elements that make for successful Summitry, and this could apply to U.S.-Russia, U.S.-China, but I think North Korea's on our mind a lot. And I guess I'm going to do alliteration on my three C's. This is the three P's. It's the personal, the policy, and the political. Then in the cases we looked at, as I talked about with the handshake, personal trust was developed. Reagan and Gorbachev developed an enormous amount of political trust, actually to the consternation of some of Reagan's hawkish advisors, that makes possible concessions in the belief that your partner is being straight with you and will lead to other things. Policy, which is based on a mutuality, just like I said about Taiwan and Vietnam. We each got some, that there's a mutuality, not one side thinking they're coming out with everything. And then the politics, which is managing with constituencies. If we look at, and every day we hear whether the summit's going to happen or not, but let's just assume it does. I actually think the politics is my least worry. The whole Nixon goes to China, conceivably Trump could manage the politics of backlash about a deal with North Korea, and presumably Kim Jong-un can do it at home. The policy I worry about a lot. I don't see a lot of mutuality there. It would have to be, policy change, not regime change. North Koreans are interested in, part of their motivation for nuclear weapons is an insurance policy against regime change. They look at what Libya gave up in the early 2000s. They look at what Saddam got taken away by the UN. And I think there really has to be a lot of mutuality and reciprocity in there. I'm not optimistic about the way the pre-negotiations are going. And then the personal, and again, I'll be honest, I'm not sure either of these leaders has any experience or the temperament that's conducive to the kind of relationships and trust building that we saw in the other two cases. So I feel like there's a little bit of a formula there, personal policy and politics for successful Summitry. And I'm in the process of trying to write something for the blog world or the op-ed world now, laying these out and kind of giving a sense for what would need to happen on them. One I'm confident about, the other two I'm not, which I don't say is a political statement. I try to say is an analytic statement, again, drawing lessons from how you do successful Summitry among countries between countries that have been adversaries.
So, you mentioned Yitzhak Rabin as one of the peacemakers. Do we draw lessons for what's currently going on between the Israelis and the Palestinians?
Yeah, this is really, I got asked at a talk I gave, we've been having, a little bit of a book tour, not on the scale of Jim Comey, but a little bit of a book tour, and gave talks in New York, and I'm going to Chicago, and Atlanta, Denver, a bunch of other cities, and in fact, C-SPAN, if you're really interested, and this isn't enough, so C-SPAN 2 is showing one of my talks at 5:45 Saturday night that they film. They do it now at bookstores when you give talks rather than just sitting you down. And somebody at that talk asked me, or it was the one in New York, which chapter, was the most personally invested in, it really was the Rabin chapter, because I worked on the peace talks a bit when I was in the Clinton administration, 93, 94, worked on Middle East issues before that and ever since. I really felt like Rabin was the right leader. Can go into detail in the conversation. I believe that there was a good chance the Oslo process would have succeeded had he survived. It was a tragedy that he didn't. His own intelligence people had told him to wear a bulletproof vest, and he could not imagine that a countryman would try to kill him. It was out of his mindset, And I think today, there's no peace would have been perfect, but I feel pretty confident making the argument that it would be a lot better for Israel and for the Palestinians, for the United States and for the world, had the Rabin process gone forward compared to what's happening today.
Mm-hmm. And let's talk a little bit about the UN, because you had Dag Hammarskjöld, who you say was the most effective Secretary General. Why do you make that claim, and what lessons of his leadership do we take for today for the Secretary General and for the UN more broadly?
So there's a wonderful quote I got from somebody. I titled that chapter, Hammarskjöld, the Secular Pope. When he came in, he was seen as a nameless, faceless bureaucrat, and his predecessor, the first Secretary General, described the job as the most impossible job in the world. Hammarskjöld had huge impact on a number of issues before he died in a plane crash that's once again being investigated. And let me just tell one of the stories because it relates to today particularly. In 1956, in the Suez Crisis, when Britain and France and Israel invaded Egypt because of Gamal Abdel Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal. So you had two permanent members of the Security Council invading another country. And you had the United States and the Soviet Union looking at it from a Cold War perspective. And so you had coming together in this crisis, anti-colonialism, the Cold War, the Middle East, all of these issues. And Hammarskjöld was the one, with some assistance from the Canadian ambassador, Lester Mike Pearson, who managed the crisis. He went in and did the diplomacy, got the British and the French and the Israelis to withdraw. He went in and negotiated with Nasser. He and Pearson formed the first major United Nations peacekeeping force that went into Suez that was successful. And he did everything, both the strategy and the ideas to the practical. Oh my God, we got to deploy these peacekeepers right away, but we don't have helmets. So they took some American surplus helmets and they painted them blue. That's the blue helmets. So he really resolved the crisis. And so in the latest, a month or so ago, a little more now, crisis in Syria, I mean, it's always been a crisis, but the US-Russia confrontation, I was talking to some reporters and I said, we need to empower the Secretary General the way that Hammarskjöld was empowered. And it may not be the first choice strategy for either the United States or Russia, but it's probably a pretty good second choice strategy. And there is a UN negotiator, but he's not empowered. I was actually involved in this Syria issue when I was in the Obama administration. And so I said, look, all the major powers say, oh my God, we can't have a powerful Secretary General. You have to give up some prerogative, right? China would, Russia would, the United States. But no Secretary General is ever going to tell the major powers what to do on an issue that's absolutely crucial to their vital interests. But what you gain for the prerogative you give up is, a better strategy for crises that affect your own interests. And so you really make a net gain there. And so there's an argument in the book about why we need a Hammarskjöldian Secretary General. That it's not so much a direct criticism of Antonio Guterres, it's really more, how the job is defined. And the UN has a lot of other problems. This wouldn't solve them all. But what organization do we know, whether it's a government or a large organization, that can deal with its problems if it doesn't have a CEO, in effect, who people respect and is powerful? And so I really think that that's crucial. If we want a UN to be effective, we really need a more empowered Secretary General. And I kind of take on the political arguments and push back against them, why it's actually in our interest. It's not a concession.
Okay. Well, we're gonna go to questions in a second. I just wanted to ask Bruce something. Apart from the book, I mentioned that he is the co-founder of Bridging the Gap, which is about something that they call public scholarship. And maybe you can say a word or two about what that means and something that you all have accomplished in this, with this organization.
Sure. I mean, as someone who's spent most of his career as a professor, but has also ventured in the policy world, I know how much I've learned from being in the policy world that's made me a better scholar, a better writer, and a better teacher. And what I think I brought, as being somebody who's largely been, in the academic world, not maybe smarter than people whose careers are always there, but a different kind of expertise, and when you learn to work together. And it's been a little frustrating to see the academic world increasingly, not just in my discipline, kind of going into its ivory tower. Not just today, all the problems we face, but this is something we've worked on for 15 years now. So with some support from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, one of the major foundations, we created this program with my colleague Jim Golgar, who will be here at the Kluge Center in September for one of the chairs, and a couple of other, Steve Weber from Berkeley and some other, to try to help bridge the two worlds. So we run programs for PhD students in political science and international relations who may want to be academics or they may want to get in the think tank world, but to develop the skill sets, that come with, being able to speak to both worlds. We run in a couple weeks, we're running a training program for faculty, who really want to be able to connect to the policy world more. We started a book series with Oxford Press, in which we've got our first books coming out now that are books by academics that, at the end of 220 pages, it's not just 3 paragraphs on what the policy implications are. And so there's really been, in fact, tomorrow we're having a meeting in New York of all the programs that the Carnegie funds on this. But it's really been an effort of mutuality. And for universities, even if we have nothing smart to contribute to policy, universities as institutions in society have huge roles to play. We get a lot of benefits. I've stayed in universities and not gone totally into the academic because I really love what we do, working with students, having the freedom to write and that sort of thing. But the worlds need to be bridged. And I was saying to Jay McCullough before, I just finished chairing a committee at Duke this semester, reviewing our tenure standards from a variety of factors, including public scholarship, far beyond what we're talking about, but for the sciences and for the humanities, for the divinity school, for math and stuff. And I may have more wounds on my back than I did from working in the Middle East from that. But I think, and we're still in the process of doing that, but I think it's an issue of, call it, interconnection or cross-fertilization or whatever. So we've built up this particular program in our area, and it's sort of one of those bottom-up strategies. A lot of people have come through our programs now who are out there building their careers, and hopefully universities will change to make the top-down meet the bottom-up.
Yeah. So let's see, folks can signal to me if you have a question. Gentleman right up here.
Yeah, you were talking about the effectiveness of the UN, and I was wondering, do you think the legitimacy of the UN's moral authority has been hampered recently? Especially, I'll give an example off the top of my head: the Human Rights Council having countries like Russia and Venezuela on their board. Do you think that hampers the effectiveness of the UN?
Unquestionably, it does. That's why I said there are many issues. There was just a commission chaired by Kevin Rudd, former Australian Prime Minister, that has a long agenda for UN reform. That's one. There have been scandals with peacekeepers, sexual scandals with peacekeepers. I guess there was bringing cholera to Haiti. There are a whole slew of issues. My sense of things, though, is we need an effective UN in the world, right? And we need it, frankly, now more than ever. And so. The only thing I deal with in this book is the role of the Secretary General, because I think a lot of things could flow from that. Hammarskjöld's notion of the secular pope was about the moral authority that he exercised and brought it there. There are things the UN can do that governments can't do. I mean, Syria, to me, is a really good example right now, and there are a whole host of others. And many other reforms would have to happen. But sometimes we look at the UN and we say, here's all its negatives. And we look at American foreign policy and we say, here's all its positives. And so we got to do a two-column accounting of both and then figure out how to change it, because we really do need an effective UN. And the notion of blowing it up or cutting off our funding or telling countries that don't vote the way we want them to that we're not going to give them foreign aid, it's just counterproductive, right? So, it's been a little bit of tough love directed at kind of liberal internationalists, people that believe in the UN. It's not enough to say what's wrong with the anti-UN. If you really believe in the UN, you got to do a little tough love on it. And part of what I'm doing in this book is along those lines.
Yes, the three C's that you talked about, being the constraints and the conduciveness and the choices, reminded me a lot of Machiavelli's kind of virtu and fortuna type thing. And I was wondering what peacemaker in your book you thought faced the most restrictive constraints that they had to deal with.
Oh, that's a really good question.
Great question.
That's a great question. And so I'm going to have to think on my feet of... I probably would say, and if I thought about it later tonight, I'd need your email, I might change my mind. I would probably say Gorbachev, because the system was so ossified. And he was trying to do this balancing of domestic change with international change. And in the end of the day, it caught up with him, right? I don't think it had to. So U.S. Ambassador Jack Matlock wrote two very long memoirs. He actually is a Duke grad, and he's been spending these latter years at Duke, and I've talked with Ambassador Matlock. And in spring and summer of 1991, President George H.W. Bush and Ambassador Matlock were warning Gorbachev about what they were picking up on what was being, they didn't specifically say the coup is going to be attempted on such a day. And the skill set that Gorbachev had started with that made him so successful kind of abandoned him, whether it was the arrogance of power that, the longer you're in power. And he just kind of dismissed their, I don't need to worry, it's really okay, I'm here. And so the combination of the nationalism that was unleashed among the republics, the Baltics first, the real difficulties of economic change, his commitment to glasnost, which opened up the political process, and not, one of the expressions I take out of the business leadership literature that relates to Gorbachev and to Rabin is the need to control the temperature and keep the opposition close. This is in some of the leadership books that are written in the business community. And neither one of those did that. And I think Gorbachev's challenge, I think Rabin could have, his was a little more manageable, but so that's one I'd probably nominate as the most difficult to really consolidate so that he's disappeared, I guarantee you, and first of all, when he passes away, there will be enormous accolades all over the world, except for inside his own country.
So as a scholar of leadership, what are the leadership challenges for the EU right now?
So the leadership, so in the end of the book, I don't necessarily, sometimes people ask, so who do you think are the 21st century peacemakers? And I intentionally don't point to people, because a lot of these people, you went to point to Rabin earlier in his career, you went to point to Gorbachev, who knew Lech Walesa. I talk about strategies that you can derive from this in each of those 5 areas, and there's similarities and differences for it. I actually had a chapter I was working on the founding of the EU, but we had to, again, to make it marketing a book, we had to keep the length. And it was going to be about Monnet, Schuman, and Adenauer together in the founding of the EU, because, whatever else EU's done wrong, the fact that, there has not been a major power war in Europe after 2 world wars started there is not small potatoes. So I think its challenges are policy. My own analysis is they didn't keep symmetrical the political change and the policy and economic change. So they had this enormous integration. They went to a single currency. There was a rule that you couldn't run about more than 2% of your GDP as your fiscal deficit. Nobody enforced it, So Greece ran up its deficit. Germany then came in, which really had all of the economic power and imposed its own, views, which were coming out of what it went through in the Weimar Republic. So they're going to have to find a greater, kind of equilibrium between how far they want to take the political change and how much they coordinate policy. I think they've actually seen the worst of their days. I just came back from Britain, and so in June 2016, I've been invited to London to Chatham House, Royal Institute of International Affairs, to give a talk on how our domestic politics are affecting our foreign policy. Turned out to be 3 days after Brexit. So I walked in and said, why don't you guys talk to me, And so Brexit is a huge issue. Catalonia may be an issue. The right wing is a huge issue. But I think that they're going to have to manage those. My own sense is I think the EU can survive it. But at the same time, in the nuts and bolts of policy, it's going to have to figure out, how to, if it wants more political integration, it's going to have to, make sure the governments comply. Because it's still kind of like the United Nations. It's really a bunch of governments coming together under an umbrella.
So we got, Andrew.
Thank you very much for a most interesting discussion. I would appreciate your inclusion of social movements and non-governmental organizations, and I also appreciate the fact that you point out that there are limitations to what they can do, and eventually state institutions and governmental authorities have to pick up in order to push the process along. You think about Martin Luther King pushing up from the bottom and Lyndon Johnson pushing down from the top to achieve civil rights legislation. I'm wondering, based on your historical research, can you offer suggestions for that process of passing the baton from a social movement to government institutions? How do we ease that along?
So let me give you an example. In the section on advancing freedom and human rights that the Amnesty International chapter's in and some of the others, at the end I say that NGOs are going to be extremely important in the human rights area. Because the reality, whether it's the Human Rights Council or US foreign policy, there's a lot of inconsistency, to say the least, there. And so what we're seeing as NGOs, get the kind of technologies. So for example, with what was happening with Rohingya, the first reports came from Human Rights Watch, who now had satellite technology that could photograph the same way we were dependent upon intelligence agencies to do. And intelligence agencies of governments may or may not share that information. So I actually think they will continue to be extremely important on flagging human rights issues. They've developed enormous expertise over the years. There's a little market competition among human rights NGOs because they all need funding from foundations and others. But you're right, at the end of the day, they can't change the policy, right? So I think that, that their role there in calling attention, they're not going to be as important in major power geopolitics. There can be some things. Secondly is in this philanthropy statesmanship. If you watch the role the Gates Foundation has played, one of the chapters in the book is on Gro Harlem Brundtland, she was the Prime Minister of Norway, but she's in there for her international role, first in chairing the World Commission on Sustainable Development in the 80s that took the term and the thinking of sustainable development, into the mainstream, and that you could be green in both ways, right, both for environment and for money. And then she took over the WHO in the 90s and really reformed it, got it paying more attention to a variety of issues, and then, unfortunately, the other leaders let it go. I think that's where foundations come in. I think in the case of Ebola and others, as the WHO spun its wheels, the Gates Foundation and others, the Doctors Without Borders and others, got in there and did things. So those are two areas, environment, or three, environment, the sustainability, global public health and environment, and human rights, where I think we need, again, the notion of what governments are unable or unwilling to do, and to push to get governments to act.
The guy right here in the back, Mike or Nick.
Has the wired world made changes in the ability to have transformational relationships? Your quote from Kennedy earlier, I think, was related to the media, but it seems to me if time and personal attention are needed, there's also more heat and light coming from putting those leadership relationships under a microscope or into blogs almost immediately, and has that changed the ability to make them possible?
I think it's added the complication, particularly like the time factor. It's very hard to control message, or sometimes I know if you make a policy decision, you got to get out quickly, and sometimes any of us know from any situation that a quick decision may not be well thought through and well researched. But again, I go back to, and I try to build up to the US-China opening and the Red China, and I go back on the Soviet Union, and I go back on Rabin and others. And who would have thought Mandela, would get out of prison, that the South African political transformation would be peaceful and democratic, that he, after 27 years in prison, had plenty of reason to, be resentful. So I don't think our current situation precludes it. I really don't at all. I think people in some ways are anxious for vision and leadership. I acknowledge that some respects social psychologists will say that appealing to people's fear and anxiety psychologically can always be easier than to their hope and aspirations, and that's an inherent psychological problem. But I feel like with everything we're going through now, I actually think that the table's being set, for that sort of thing, and so I hold out, and I don't think it's naive. I think it's based on that, based on the research I did and the intractability of many of these problems. I'm not betting my next non-subprime mortgage payment that it's going to happen, soon. But I think there's an analytic and strategy path to make those kinds of things happen in a variety of areas. Environment's a good example where, you read a magazine from the real estate industry now. They sound like my old boss Al Gore, right? Because they have all these, hotels on the shoreline of Miami Beach and elsewhere. And so the business community has begun to see that. We have a political issue in our country, that's been problematic there. But you begin to see change, and then you need leadership that can tap that change. That's that person and moment. With all due respect to Al Gore, who I think was extraordinarily insightful, the moment in 1992 or even 2000 on the environment, it just wasn't there, right? And so it's where these two intersect. How and when they intersect isn't always predictable. But I think on some of these issues, we're really at a moment where people would respond to leaders that they believe have this authenticity and a vision that, that is somewhat reassuring that change can lead to better futures.
We have time for one more question if we have it. This gentleman over here, last question.
I wanted to ask a little bit about Irving Babbitt. I want to see if you think there's a connection between a strong moral character, both in the citizenry and of these statesmen, that correlates to good statesmanship.
And what was the first thing you wanted to ask about who?
Oh, Irving Babbitt. I'm just channeling him.
Okay. So I use the term in the book personal capital, in which moral capital is a subset. So it's hard to talk about Kissinger and Zhou Enlai having moral capital, right? But they had personal capital. Mandela had moral capital. Aung San Suu Kyi in that role had moral capital. Rabin had enormous moral capital. And so I sort of define it as qualities that the person has that are not just a function of the position they occupy. The two Northern Irish women had it. Valenza had it as a worker. And that's enormously important. There's an authenticity thing that people, the average person wants to know that, you really are what you say you are. Having worked in quite a few presidential campaigns and gone through the consultant as the perfect resume, I think that these qualities, and so when I talk about leadership, I use this broad sense of personal capital, and it is really important for transformational change. And it's not necessarily, there are very few leaders in the book who were like, LeBron James, coming out, immediately you could see, or Mozart as a young person. They emerge through their life experiences, and they get to that point. Mandela is probably the closest because he, came out of this particular, upbringing. But the others are, who would have thunk at an earlier point in their lives. Okay.
Bruce, thank you for coming back to the library to share your thoughts on public scholarship and the actual scholarship you've done. And we have a reception that we would like to invite you to enjoy, as well as Bruce's signing copies of his books.
Happy to sign books.
Woodrow Wilson.
Great. Good. Thanks,
All right.
Tom, very much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.